Maureen Callahan says these women's real endings are not always happy, but they are true, and therein lies the power of these stories. Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell, and this is the last episode of our journey through Maureen Callahan's book, Ask Not: The Kennedys and the Women They Destroyed. And it has been such a good time with you guys. I really want to get into it, but the first thing I just want to say is thank you. Thank you for making it through this journey with me and coming back. I feel so honored that you've come, and I really expected maybe a few hundred people would be willing to go through this with me, and you guys have just blown me away with wanting to go through it with me and offering such good input and feedback. I feel really, really blessed and grateful. So with that out of the way, let's get into our last episode. I feel excited, and I also feel like a little bit of bittersweet of like, even though it's been like a lot of hard stories, I'm not sure I fully am ready for it to end. I've enjoyed it, and I hope you have too. Let's read about these women. The epilogue of this book is great because even though she's walked us through all these stories, few of them ended with death. And obviously those chapters has the full story, but many of the stories left us through perhaps the final piece of the puzzle that she was wanting to share with us. However, she goes ahead in the epilogue and gives us the final wrap up. So like, what did become of Joan Kennedy? Or what happened to Rosemary? What happened after the lobotomy and when she was put away? And so this epilogue answers those questions. What were Jackie's final years like? Those kinds of questions we're going to have answered here. And so also the other thing that I am going to do is at the end, I want to just wrap up my thoughts about the book, and I want to invite your thoughts about the book, because I know plenty of us have had really enthusiasm about the quantity of the stories we've been told and the particular choices of who she told us about has been really eye-opening. But then I know many of you have expressed your concerns, and so we'll get to that in the final analysis. But let's just get through the epilogue and kind of read what she tells us about each of these women. Jackie Onassis gave a quote that she starts out this section with, and it's interesting because she essentially says that being an editor expands what you're familiar with and gives you greater discernment and discrimination. And she says each book takes you down another path. And I think that's what has happened through this book, that we have gotten many different pathways that all were in the stream of Kennedys or Kennedy adjacent people. But we got to live many different kinds of lives through the eyes of these women. We got to see World War II Britain. We got to see the medicalization of mental health and the things that were happening even with eugenics through the life of Rosemary and the choices of Rose and Jo. So each of these women, we've had the opportunity to learn things that have been fascinating and interesting and taken us down a different path. And so, yeah, Jackie's quote is very insightful there for that. I loved this particular paragraph that Callahan wrote. Such is the guiding philosophy of this book. The most famous of these women have too often been recast as architects of their own demise, or as women who were asking for it, or as imminent threats to the Kennedy dynasty. Those who were less well known or merely teenage girls have simply become footnotes in history if they are remembered at all. I think this actually summarizes the nature of many of these women. Now, no one has forgotten about Jackie O. She is perhaps the least represented by that quote, but almost every chapter in the book could be filtered into either women who have been, by the public eye, seen as kind of like, well, she knew what she was getting into and she asked for it, and that's just kind of the way it was, or footnotes to history in that people remember them as the blonde or that girl in the car accident, like reduced to a footnote, a little, a side note to the main event of the Kennedys. Whereas for each of these women, of course, this was their whole life. It was their one precious life that they got to live in the world, and it was tainted in some way by their affiliation or connection or impacted by the choices of Kennedys. The example that she gives is very fascinating because it's a woman that was not featured in the book. Her story was told a smidge in the final chapter of Carolyn Bessette. It's a woman named Bowman, Patricia Bowman, and she had accused William Kennedy Smith of an SA, or graping her. She gave an interview to Diane Sawyer on December 19th, 1991, and Sawyer was very aggressive and skeptical and hardlined against Patricia Bowman in her questioning. She asked why, after an aggressive effort to protect your privacy, she was now going public with her name and face in this interview. And Bowman's answer, which sounds exactly like what she had expressed in other venues, so it's her continual expression of what her intent was by bringing the charge and then by going ahead and going public when William Kennedy Smith was acquitted of having committed a grape against her. Here's what she said. The verdict is why I came forward. Quote, I know that the reporting of grapes has gone down. And Maureen Callahan notes they had gone down by 40%. So there were 40% less grapes being reported at the time that she came forward with this charge. And she says, I'm terrified that victims everywhere who have seen my case and potential victims who have seen my case will not report because of what happened to me. This is a valid concern on Bowman's part, and it's a concern for us because the biggest reason why women do not report that they have been victimized by either some sort of molestation or SA or grape. The reason why those things are not reported most frequently is because they believe that no one will believe them. Now, there's also other concerns, which we can all empathize with, which is that after something awful, terrible, humiliating, degrading, painful, life-altering has happened to you, you don't necessarily want to relive it. You don't want to have to go through depositions and questioning and getting on the witness stand and going to have things tested and taken from you in order to prove that this awful thing that just happened. So there's already that hurdle to get over, but then that you could do all of that and then people would not believe you and the person would get off anyway, and you would have used potentially 1.5 to 2.5 years of your life going through all this legal strain over something that already was a violation. So that actually is a major concern that we should all share. And she said that her reason for coming forward was to encourage other women to go ahead and speak out. Callahan notes that CNN and other primary sources had made Bowman into the target by referencing things like, quote, her obvious mental problems, or that she was, quote, disturbed, that her overall instability and sexual promiscuity were the basis of her accusation. And she noted in this interview, this is well known as a tactic of the Kennedy PR campaign. Sawyer replied, tell me about it. What do you mean? Sawyer had been in political spheres previously. She had been a member of President Nixon's staff. She had worked on his She had worked on his memoirs, and she was well versed in the tactics of political warfare. She knew at this point, we're talking about the early 90s. So for more than 2 decades, she had been in the circles where this very sort of thing happens. You discredit someone through character assassination. That happens all the time. It happens in journalism. It happens in politics, of course. And it certainly happens when there's a prominent figure who's been accused of bad behavior and they want to smear the person who has brought it. Sawyer, in her line of questioning, says that Kennedy Smith was the real victim here. He can't get his name back. She also mentioned that Bowman had once had a one-night stand. So this is part of the evidence of that it wasn't, that the other thing with Kennedy Smith was not grape. Part of the evidence she gives is that at some point Bowman had had a one-night stand. Those two things are not related at all. One is not evidence for or against the other. The other can have happened if she never had any one-night stands or if she had 50. This could still be a violation against her person and could still have happened. So the fact that one happened is not related to the other. She also mentions that why had she been out, dressed for male attention at 3 a.m? Okay. Yeah, that's a question for her. And I'm sure Patricia Bowman probably asked herself that question. Why did I go? Why was I eager for his attention? I wish I hadn't have done that. Still, Bowman asks this question, which is totally right. Because I was out at 3 a.m, does that mean he has the right to grape me? Very fair. It's a crime. It's a crime to do whether it's 3 p.m. or 3 a.m. It's a crime to do whether she's wearing a burqa or a business suit or a nurse's scrubs uniform or dressed for male attention. No matter what, it's wrong to do that to a woman. And so, yes, can we all be wiser and try to make better choices so that we are in less likelihood of being harmed? Sure. We all recognize there's very few of us that would be willing to just walk alone through the worst part of the most violent city in the world at midnight. Sure, we all recognize there are more safe places and more unsafe places. And yet, that still never makes murder just a natural consequence. Duh. It's all your fault for getting murdered, or it's all your fault for getting this done to you. So the reasoning that was being used against her was wrong. And this is the quote that Callahan says. She says, "The idea that Sawyer had no idea what the Kennedy machine did and still does to troublesome women beggars belief." So, yes, Sawyer's reaction is the reaction of journalists across the decades to Kennedy bad behavior. Well, the women knew. Well, she was already of age. Well, she knew when she was getting into. Well, he was already that way when she married into it. And at no point is the man held to account. Well, he was 39. Well, he was married with multiple children. Well, he took a vow. There are plenty of reasons why they ought to have been held to a higher standard of behavior, right? But no. Again, in Diane Sawyer's interview, we see the same dynamics at work. That when there is a problem of a troublesome woman, the troublesome woman is held to far greater account than the responsible Kennedy male is. And that's the issue that this book is addressing. That's the very heartbeat of this book. She says this also holds true for the babysitter, whom the late Michael Kennedy statutorily graped. Those interested enough can find her name on Google. I won't repeat it here. She was 14 years old when this abuse began, successfully reframed by the Kennedys and repeated to this day as a love affair. And I just want to say there is actually a whole world that most of you mercifully are unfamiliar with, but in the homeschooling world, there was this huge name of a man who created a company and founded it. It was a big, giant homeschooling juggernaut of a company that had its tendrils in books and curriculum and conferences and teaching packages and CDs that were mailed across the nation. It started out with tapes, then it became CDs, and children's toys and Pilgrim era clothing and Little House on the Prairie era clothing, and so on. There were trips to various locales, and this man was at the helm of it. I'm not saying his name, but the similarity to Michael Kennedy is stark. He had a wife who had, I believe, 7 children at the time. They hired a nanny. It was the friend's child who was a little bit, this is such a grooming situation, a little bit from a troubled family life, and it was looked at as like this awesome founder of this amazing homeschool company with 7 children. What a godly man is hiring our daughter to come and be their nanny. And so what a great opportunity for her to learn and be mentored by this wonderful family and see a healthy family and all of it, right? That's the picture that was pitched to them. And by the end of her time, she had been groomed, sexually abused routinely, and it was all cast as she was the seductress who had lured him in somehow. No, she was not even of age. She was not the problem. He was the problem. The person who pursues the child, the minor, he's the one with the issue, not her. And we don't like this. We don't need to name her. We don't need to shame her. She needs counseling and healing and love of kind-hearted, good-willed people who are actually seeking her long-term good, which is exactly the opposite of what was done to her in that home by that supposedly honorable man. Same story here. It's not a love affair. If it involves a minor, it's not an affair, it's not a love affair, it's not adultery. It is SA. It is grape, if it goes to that level. It is a crime. It is not a little seduction, a little mistaken love, a little searching for love in all the wrong. That's not what this is. This is criminal. We're back to the Kennedy story with the babysitter, 14 years old when the abuse began. As the affair made headlines, her parents were prominent in business and political circles. Her mother attempts to take her own life. The story fades from view, and part of why it faded from view is that Michael Kennedy was breaking rules skiing down Copper Mountain in Aspen. He and fellow Kennedys were tossing a football while skiing downhill. He wasn't wearing a helmet. He crashed into a tree and died on impact in 1998. And this, you might already be anticipating it. This was covered not as the end of justice for this young girl whose life had been irretrievably harmed by a Kennedy. And it was also not seen as an entirely avoidable, reckless action. Again, that's very in line with Kennedy behavior. But no, it was yet more proof of the so-called Kennedy curse. That Michael was guilty of statutory grape, of abusing and stalking the teenage girl over at least 3 years, was forgotten, done away with. Footnote of history. Callahan says, each time a woman accuses a famous, powerful, wealthy man of sexual harassment, abuse, or grape, and when one survivor comes forward, more usually follow. Then, tactics from the well-worn Kennedy playbook are weaponized. So, this is their pattern. They call these women liars, mentally unstable. They are scorned by any number of characterizations that are treated as legitimate by the press, usually. She also makes a plea just for us as a society. She says, any woman who comes forward, especially against a machine like the Kennedys, is likely to have her reputation shredded and her entire sexual history plastered and discussed and critiqued in the public square. She starts to give some updates on various women, and so I'm going to share those with you. Maureen Callahan says these women's real endings are not always happy, but they are true, and therein lies the power of these stories. Rosemary Kennedy, her unspeakable lobotomy, Joe Kennedy's personal sin, was 23 years old when her father rendered her mute and helpless in 1941. It wasn't until his death in 1969, that is 28 years later. 28 years. That Rose Kennedy felt she could tell her sons and daughters where Rosemary was, and that they felt it was safe to visit her. That is a family shackled by fear of their father in a way that is vile. Rosemary had lived for nearly 30 years without any contact from her parents or siblings. Can you imagine a lonelier life? I recently saw in the comment section, somebody had linked a few photos of Rosemary in the later years, and I had no idea that she did reconnect with her family. She last saw her brother Jack on television, and the nurses who cared for her said that whenever Rose secretly visited, Rosemary shrank and turned away from her. She became visibly upset and wanted nothing to do with her mother. So that's interesting. She apparently did know her, even though she lacked the ability to communicate. Rosemary's true end belies the Kennedy version. Remember, Joe Kennedy said, oh, she's gone off to live a private life teaching mentally ill children. And of course, what had actually happened is that he had taken away her mental capacity entirely. She was left without the ability to even to control her own toileting. She was dependent for the rest of her life, incapable of expression, but apparently aware of who was visiting her and her own reaction to it, which is fascinating. There are photos online that you can find, just so you know, of her in her later years occasionally spending time with Kennedy family members. And so those can be found. She is a shrunken version of herself. She seems very small and definitely a different look about her than those early joyful pictures that we saw back when she was a debutante and, finding her way as a woman who did have limitations to her capacity, probably because of the faulty birth situation. But regardless, I'll remind you, the doctors thought she just perhaps suffered from depression and that the lobotomy never could have helped her anyway. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was 33 when she died. Her sister, Lauren Bessette, a rising star at Morgan Stanley, was 34. John F. Kennedy Jr. was wholly responsible for this entirely avoidable accident. But Carolyn is the one who has had her choices that afternoon, or a pedicure, or whatever, as it was her fault that the airplane crashed when it did. In the 25 years since the crash, she has been depicted as a drug-addled woman who made the last days of America's prince so miserable. And so the implication is, if he hadn't have been so miserable, he wouldn't have been so distracted. And if he wouldn't have been late and distracted, then he wouldn't have crashed the plane. In truth, the National Transportation Safety Board found John alone responsible for this crash. And we went through all the different reasons down the sides of the book of his reasons why he should not have ever been flying that plane on that night. Had nothing to do with her. So whatever we make of her, and plenty of you have shared information that everything was not well with her. She was not an easy woman for the people around her to get along with and have interactions with. She seemed to have incredible mood swings, and she would get very angry, etc. You guys have filled in the gaps for me. I was not that familiar with Carolyn Bessette before this. I'm really grateful for those of you who were. And so, sure, she was not a perfect woman. However, none of this crash was her fault. Just because someone shows up late, he had already been advised by other seasoned pilots not to even fly. He's the one who opted not to file a flight plan. He's the one who opted to fly right after getting his cast off. He's the one who opted to fly even though he wasn't actually instrument rated. He's the one who opted to fly straight out over the ocean and not hug the coast. He's the one who turned off radio communications. None of that was her fault. So whatever you make of her, that's fine. You don't have to like her. You don't have to think she was great. You don't have to think she was pretty. You don't have to like her wedding dress, right? All of us have different opinions about her. Regardless, it was his choices that ended her life. And that is tragic. And that's a Kennedy flaw. That's his judgment on display. It's really unrelated to who or what she was. He gets to have his own judgment and responsibility for that, regardless of who she was. Mimi and Diana. This one brought out a lot of comments from many of you. And I will point out, she has a memoir, Mimi does. It's called Once Upon a Secret, My Affair with President John F. Kennedy and Its Aftermath. That was published in 2012. The book became a #1 bestseller on New York Times bestseller list. And the esteemed historian and JFK biographer Robert Dallek called Mimi, quote, entirely credible, end quote. He said her book is an important part of our historical reckoning with President Kennedy. Since the book, Mimi has retreated from public life, so it really does seem that her intent all along has been to remain private. She did so until she was outed by a couple of different biographers and interviews. So she came forward to tell her story and to process it herself. And now she's gone away. She's not still trying to pitch a movie or write another book or write a fictional account that makes it more sensationalized. She's enjoying her private life and we ought to let her. Diana DeVeg published her own account in an article online. And she said that was thanks to the hashtag #MeToo movement. I began eventually to question the culture because the culture was about enabling a great man, she said. John Kennedy did not have his womanizing life all by himself. He had it thanks to many, many, many other men. She practices as a psychotherapist in New York City. So these women are entitled to their privacy and they're entitled to tell their part of the story. And neither one has told it like a boo-hoo narrative, like, oh, poor me. They've each tried to be forthright and own their part, but also tell the truth through the wizened lens of decades, which we all get to do about our lives. I'm sure that each of you have things when you think back about your life, there were things that you did not understand. Something. It could have been a bullying situation in second grade, or it could have been something that you missed out on because you didn't actually read the room right, and maybe you missed out on a great job or an opportunity, or perhaps you were harmed or abused by someone. And the way that works in the mind of a younger person is often to receive blame and shame entirely from it. But the older we get and the more that we see what a 7-year-old looks like or what a 19-year-old young virgin woman looks like, we start to reassess. It is right for them to process those things. And by making their stories public, they have given us the opportunity to grow in discernment and learn from their experiences. Marilyn Monroe, she died on August 4th, 1962. The official cause was, quote, probable suicide. But suspicion has forever hung around the Kennedy brothers. Callahan tells us that earlier that day, Marilyn had told her friend Jeannie Carmen, I never know how to say these names, Jean Carmen, that she had gotten harassing phone calls the night before. A familiar woman's voice telling her to, quote, leave Bobby alone, end quote. The FBI was dispatched to Marilyn's home immediately upon her death. Former senior FBI agent James Doyle later went public, saying the Bureau had been ordered to eliminate certain phone records. Are your red alarm bells ringing? Because mine are. I wish I could actually read you every bit of this whole page, but I'm just going to summarize it. One biographer uncovered some of the phone records, and he was able to identify that Marilyn Monroe had called the Justice Department repeatedly. That's where Bobby worked. Robert F. Kennedy, RFK, JFK's little brother, worked at the Justice Department. She called him the general, remember? She called him 8 times between June 25th and July 30th. Remember, she died on August 4th. Her final call got through and it lasted 8 minutes. Reportedly, she had had an abortion at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in LA on July 20th, 1962. Recent theories have included that this may have been Bobby's baby. If so, that would explain why she was so desperate to reach out to him during that time frame. Audio tapes from her surveillance system also went missing. So phone records went missing, surveillance system records went missing. The deputy DA, district attorney of LA County, John Minor, he officially observed Marilyn Monroe's autopsy. He later reconstructed the report that he had given back in 1962 at the time of her death. In that reconstruction, he noted that the psychiatrist of Marilyn had shared certain things with him and even let him listen to an extended part of Marilyn Monroe talking about her future plans. He said, quote, "As a result of what Dr. Greenson told me and from what I heard on tape recordings, I believe I can say definitely that it was not suicide," end quote. Callahan wants us to know that in the 1980s, there had been planned a viewing of a special television show regarding the Kennedy brothers and their connection to Marilyn's death. At 6 p.m. on the day of that special, she says, with mere hours to go, ABC pulled the plug. ABC News president Roone Arledge, who canceled the documentary, was a longtime friend of Ethel Kennedy. Joe DiMaggio had indicated that he thought that the Kennedys were responsible for her death. Quote, "The whole lot of Kennedys were lady killers, and they always got away with it. They'll be getting away with it 100 years from now," end quote. That's what Callahan wants us to know about Marilyn Monroe. Mary Richardson Kennedy, this is RFK Jr.'s wife, his second wife, the mother of 4 of his children. She notes that those who loved and knew Mary acknowledged that she could be difficult, but said that nothing had justified the way that RFK Jr. treated her. They described a woman, quote, who had been psychologically and financially beaten down by Bobby Kennedy Jr. And so far what she notes is that he keeps getting the last word. That right after Mary's death, he gave an interview to the New York Times about the marriage being difficult for him, and that the ensuing media coverage after that was pitting her against him, with Mary being the problem and Bobby being the victim. Wasn't it incredible that Bobby survived a marriage like that? Was the basic tenor of the coverage. Kit Kennedy, she gives us a little reminder and overview of the title that she had, Marchioness of Hartington. But it says that 2 books, recent books by Barbara Lemming, which is called Kick Kennedy, and Parla Burns, Kick, the true story of JFK's sister and the heir to Chatsworth, have told about her life. And so she's no longer been relegated to just being a footnote of history, that people are at least remembering her and telling her story. So I wanted to pass those book titles on to you in case you are interested more in Kick, because a lot of you really found her story inspiring and wanted to know more about her. Like me, I didn't know anything about Kick Kennedy. I don't think I had ever even heard her name. So to learn that much about her was really fascinating. I do want to say that in the time since this reading, the way that she made it sound, and even the placement in the book, if you remember, her chapter was in a section called Lonely Graves. Lonely Graves. And she particularly ended Kick's chapter by noting that her gravestone didn't even have a last name. This is what she said her gravestone reads. So I'm going to come up close for you guys. In loving memory of Kathleen, with the dates. And then she says she was given no last name. And I thought, oh my goodness, that is awful. You know, like she's not a Kennedy and she's not anywhere. And it just makes it sound so dramatic. Well, and I actually thought that this was like an exact quote of what that gravestone said. It's not. Y'all, she has a very lengthy gravestone. And I just feel like in the spirit of honesty, I just want to share that with you guys, that actually she had a very lovely gravestone. It talks about how she gave joy and she received joy and more. It tells her various titles, and it's in the style of British aristocracy, that she didn't actually, just like how, like they say Harry Wales, for example, was his name, or they each use the name sort of William Cambridge, but that's not actually how they speak about their name. They are the Duke of Cambridge or the Prince of Wales or the whatever. This was an entirely appropriate thing that she is Kathleen, and then it says Marchioness of Hartington and etc. That it gives her, and it even says the name Kennedy on her gravestone, y'all. I feel like I'm gonna put up a photo here so you guys can look at what her headstone looks like. In the spirit of honesty, I just wanted to share that with you guys, that I felt like that was a misrepresentation. I feel like it was one of the examples that we're gonna get to of just sensationalism in this book that didn't have to be there. In the vein of honesty, I just want to let you guys know that actually she was quite honored by her headstone. It is a lovely headstone. It speaks well of her, and it's not some gravestone that's like what I was picturing was like out in a field, and it's just like Kathleen who, we don't know, just has dates, but that's not the way it is at all. So thought you guys should know that. Mary Jo Kopechne. Gwen and Joe Kopechne never recovered, of course, from their only child's death. They also never got past the falsehood that Ted had given them of, eventually I'll tell you. They were never told. They were never given the keys to understand how their daughter died. And not only that, but there was this ongoing insinuation about their daughter that basically she was just a Kennedy groupie who had gone off that night to have sex with Ted. Joe and Gwen didn't have enough strength or financial resources to sue or pursue any kind of legal action against Ted. It was a struggle enough for them to just survive. If you guys haven't seen it, then be glad. But Ted Kennedy wrote a memoir called True Compass, which is just so ironic, as if he had a true compass that guided his life. He did not. In that memoir, published 1 month before his death, it says he gave 4 out of 507 pages to explaining that night. Here are some of the quotes. In fact, I will just read it to you. My car, he wrote, quote, slipped off the side of the narrow bridge, end quote. Maureen Callahan wants us to note that it's not like I drove the car off the bridge. It's not terrified I made my way over the bridge. His sentence is, my car slipped off. So it's passive, it's avoiding blame. And of course, many of you, like me, hold out questions about exactly what happened on the bridge that night. In fact, those very questions are why we are going through this book right now. We are a good many chapters into this book. If you have not gone over and tried out this book, I really want to urge you to do so. And we can just go ahead and talk about it right now. We'll come right back to Mary Jo CHAPPAQUIDDICK. But I want to tell you guys, one thing that I love about this book is that Leo D'Amour goes line by line through all kinds of newspaper articles, interviews, radio discussions, etc., and literally quotes what is happening and where he got his information. And I cannot tell you guys what a refreshing thing this is compared to what we've had in this book. I'm getting close to that, to telling you guys what my final analysis is, but I'm telling you this part right here is one of my favorite parts of this book, because he is citing line, chapter, and quote of each thing that he is claiming in the book. So when he says Diver Farrar said blah, 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 he shows you which radio interview he's talking about or exactly what year the diver said that. So this book, I'm loving it, but he is going piece by piece, factual data by factual data, bringing us along through the story of how this happened. And one of the questions in our minds is, was Ted the driver? Was he even in the car when it went off the bridge? Is that why he says things like this? My car slipped off the side of the narrow bridge. Is it because he had already ditched the car? Did he jump out the window? She let him off and then she drove? What happened in the car? What we do know is that his statement doesn't even fit with the immediate evidence of the moment. The people who read it at the time that it was given. I mean, we're talking about the very hour that it was written. Already people's alarm bells are going off with the statement. And that's before it's even made its way across the nation and through the newspapers and so on. So yeah, we've all got questions. And Maureen Callahan wants to hammer on this because she has taken the view that Ted was the driver and that he's the one entirely responsible for the accident. And so she's angry about the passive voice. I'm angry about all the discrepancies of what happened in that case. And I want you to follow along with me. If you are fascinated, please come with me on this journey because it has already been so good and we are really enjoying it. You're not too far behind. You can jump in and get caught up, and we are going to go through this book and take in the evidence and really learn a lot together. So that's my invitation to you. To wrap up Mary Jo CHAPPAQUIDDICK, it says, despite promising to one day tell Gwen and Joe what had happened to their daughter, Ted took it to his grave. And I just want to say that there have been a couple of instances where Joey Gargan, Joey Gargan, who had rented the cottage at CHAPPAQUIDDICK, he's Ted Kennedy's cousin. He was a primary source for this book. So he spoke out and gave some information for the formation of this book in the 80s. A couple of the Boiler Room girls have given slight comments, very small, but I personally, I'll just tell you guys, and maybe this is my naive hopefulness, but I still do hold out hope that someone is either going to be the last one of that party who's still alive and go ahead and spill the beans for us and tell us what happened, or that maybe one of them wrote it down and in a journal said, after the remaining person in this party has passed away and it's been 5 years later, this journal entry can be released. And then here's what really happened. I don't know, but I do hold out hope that somewhere, someone is going to tell the truth, if for no other reason, but just out of loyalty to Mary Jo, because we do know that these women were close. And when I think about if you were a young woman in your 20s and you had worked like shoulder to shoulder with other young women, and you guys had precious friendships and lots of rich memories, and you had even mourned the loss of RFK together, and you had just really entered into a special series of events in your life together, and then came to a tragic end, and you knew what had happened to that woman, I feel like you would have a great amount of urgency to eventually tell what happened to the world. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's my naive hopefulness again, but I do hold out hope for that. Joan Kennedy did divorce Ted. We talked about that. Jackie actually referred her to the same divorce attorney that she had been consulting when she was thinking about and planning on leaving Aristotle Onassis. Joan never did remarry, and she published books, she survived breast cancer, and she did continue to struggle with sobriety deeply. To the point that in 2006, Callahan tells us after her children tried to take control of her care and finances, she was placed under court-mandated supervision to stop drinking. Now 87, she lives in Boston and Squaw Island, Massachusetts. So she's under the care of her family and she is still alive. It gives us a quick update on Pamela Kelly, but I found that this information was basically very similar to what the end of the chapter contained. So I'm just going to pass over that, but note that if you have the book, you can go back and read what she said about Pamela. Martha Moxley, she gives us an update on that case. It says that she was buried November 4th, 1975, and it would take decades before Michael Skakel was arrested for her murder. He was convicted in 2002 and sentenced to 20 years to life. But in 2013, after years of agitating, his cousin, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., that is the one who just had been running for president and now has stepped away from his campaign. He has suspended his campaign and thrown his support behind President Trump. That Robert F. Kennedy Jr. helped push for a retrial. Skakel was released on $1.2 million bond, and his conviction was vacated in 2018. She notes, and this is something that's going to relate to what we'll talk about at the end, in November 2021, Maureen Callahan became the last person to see the state's evidence in Martha's case. It contained everything from her personal diary to the murder weapon. Under state law, that evidence was about to be sealed away forever, and she was the last one to see it. The person who was the prosecutor in the case, Suzanne Gill, said that her greatest fear is that the evidence will now be destroyed. So, regardless, Maureen Callahan has seen the evidence in that box, and that's fascinating in and of itself. Rose Kennedy, most historians believe, had no knowledge of her husband's plan to lobotomize their daughter. It was only after Joe's death that Rose visited Rosemary. I just want to point out, y'all, this is one of these things, again, we'll talk about it in we're almost to the end of these updates, and then we're going to talk about the book. But it says Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy outlived 3 of her 9 children and died from pneumonia on January 22nd, 1995. And I just want to say she outlived 4 of her 9 children. Joe Jr., first son, had died. Jack, JFK, had died. Kik had died. RFK had died. She outlived 4 of her 9 children. To me, this is one of these examples of the lack of reliable details in this book. Many of the broad brushstrokes with which she paints give an accurate representation, but there are too many of these, what we can call minor details, except they're not minor. This is history, and people are relying on this. And I came into this book hoping to view it as a really accurate account. And details being misrepresented like this just make me feel cautious about this book. I'll leave it at that. She does give a specific update on Rosemary that she lived her post-lobotomy life at St. Coletta's, a private Catholic facility in Jefferson, Wisconsin. She lived in a small 1-story cottage and was attended to by nuns and lay nurses. After Joe died, Ted Kennedy, Eunice Kennedy, and Rosie's nephew Tim Shriver became the closest to Rosie. They would fly her to Kennedy homes and play with her in their pools. They had a final birthday party for her when she was 86. And when she was admitted to the hospital for the last time in January 2005, all of her surviving siblings dropped everything to fly to her bedside, and she stayed alive until they were all there. She was buried near her mother and father in Brookline, Massachusetts. I just want to remind y'all that the lobotomy happened in 1941, and she lived until 2005. That is 64 years of a stolen life by Joe. So not only 30 of that was lived in extreme loneliness without her family around her. Y'all picture that. I mean, I know what it's like because I have a household bustling with people. They are all close to one another. They play, they laugh, they irritate each other, they make up, they have fun. And for her to have all of that bustling activity as her norm for so many years, and then to be shipped off to these various places trying to fix her, even while she tries to escape from them, and then to have the lights of her life and brain and personality switched off by Joe is just so cruel. But then to be kept from her family, the things that were familiar to her. I mean, I can't go on about it too much, y'all, because that whole episode made me nauseous and so angry. But all of that is awful enough, but I really kind of hate that they buried her next to her mother and father, the person who medically abused her, and then the woman who she turned away from volitionally. Even in her reduced capacity, she turned away from this woman and reacted violently against her. She did not enjoy the visits from Rose. So to bury her near those people just feels wrong to me. It seems like she should have been buried perhaps with the nuns, or maybe with the few siblings that cared for her after. Y'all tell me what you think. That's what I think. She gives us an update on Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis. She died May 19th, 1994, after a brief yet brutal battle with lymphoma. She was 64 years old. Her wake was held in her beloved apartment at Fifth Avenue. Her body was in a closed coffin. She wanted no one to get a final photo of the dignified Jackie O. Thousands lined the streets as her coffin made its way along Park Avenue to the church where her mass was held. And then afterward, her casket was flown to D.C., where thousands more lined the route to Arlington National Cemetery. Church bells tolled 64 times, marking the age at which she died, and then she was buried next to Jack and her babies. The eternal flame she lit, now burning for her as well. So that's the final look we get at Jackie. That's the final look we get at each of these women. I'm going to try to do a book in review sum up. Here are my thoughts. I think this book is not authoritative, with a little asterisk next to that. But it is still important. I think the reason why it is important is that it summarizes the Kennedy family's cause and effect, attitudes and machine and approach to problems, and the effect they have in the world. And I think these things are made accessible to a new generation through this book. Many of you who have commented have said, I remember when that press conference was held. I remember watching that and grieving. I remember watching that and believing Ted Kennedy. I remember watching that and knowing Ted Kennedy was lying through the whole thing. Many of you observed these things. Many of us, myself included, have only heard these stories. By the time I knew a Kennedy, it was JFK Jr., who was kind of idolized and handsome and whatever, and Ted Kennedy, who was an old man in the Senate. That's how I knew him. And it wasn't until later, perhaps my mom, I don't quite remember who, or if it was just referenced, but I became familiarized with some name that later I came to know was CHAPPAQUIDDICK. I still didn't understand the meaning until I saw the movie, y'all. I mean, that was a matter of years ago, was when it finally clicked of what all that was and just how awful it was. I had no idea. So I think Maureen Callahan's book, even though, like we talked about, there are some examples of years being wrong, ages being wrong. She puts certain people at the wrong age when they're parent was assassinated, or she, again, like says Rose outlived 3 of her children when it was actually 4. And we could say these things are minor, and if it was just one, I probably wouldn't even mention it. But there have been more than a handful of these type of research errors. For that reason is one of the reasons why we can say, I don't think it's authoritative. I don't think we can take it to the bank. Every line is not documented in the way that it is in this book, like I mentioned to you guys. However, it's important because it brings these stories alive and lets us see them in close succession so we can all identify the common themes and patterns of behavior among each story. Instead of it being a book about Rosemary, a book about Kick, a book... Many people are not going to have the patience or the time or the interest to comb through that many biographies. They might have the interest, they just don't have the capacity. But by combining them all in here and summarizing and giving us key details, she makes these stories accessible to a new generation of people so that we can observe what happens in a family with great influence and power. The research is inconsistent, but some of the chapters, like Martha Moxley's case, she actually was the last researcher to go through the evidence box. That's not far off misrepresentation of the facts. This is someone who has literally held Martha Moxley's little diary with the flower on the front, right? That's close up. She spoke with the mother of Martha Moxley at length. Mom showed her the pictures, told her the stories, hours of spending time, one-on-one time. She spent another time, I believe, with Pamela Kelly's cousin. So some of the chapters are incredibly well researched. In some of the chapters, she has primary sourcing, good sourcing. And so while we can say that some of these conversations or even situations, like we all kind of questioned, most of us, I think, felt that it was impossible that Marilyn Monroe had been with RFK right before going up on the stage to sing Happy Birthday to Jack. Most of us just didn't believe that's actually like physically possible in the dress that she was wearing and the amount of time that she had. So even though we say, you know, some of these situations seem sensationalized, some of the conversations were certainly fictionalized and there was a literary license taken, nonetheless, I have to say some of the research was excellent. So rather than saying the whole book is nonsense, what I would say is it's just inconsistent. Some of the chapters are excellently sourced and some leave some things to be desired and feel a little too sensationalistic and fictionalized to be relied on. The real problem here is that this makes it hard to read to know how seriously we should take something, right? We want to know how much validity. If I'm reading a novel, or even if I'm reading like a historical fiction, I know to just kind of take the gist and leave the details, right? But in this kind of book, some of the details we can take extremely literally because she literally held the diary. She can tell us what color it was and what was on the cover and what was in it and what the exact words were. And we can take her words and know with confidence, this is firsthand evidence right here. And then other things, not so much. So that just was frustrating to feel that some chapters I had to put a little caveat, and then some things I'm like, her resourcing was great. Nevertheless, the book is on the whole good because it serves the reader by giving repeated clear patterns of behavior and character. For example, circling the wagons, no true empathy for non-Kennedys, seeing people as tools to use, wrecking the reputations of women who pose any threat to the Kennedy group at all. The final reason why I thought it was good is that we do see imperfect women. I agree with Callahan that it's good news that she tells us even about these women's warts, personal foibles, personality traits, and part of that is exactly where we started with the Diane Sawyer interview, which is that even when women are not perfect, and I want to say none of us are, all of us fall short of the glory of God. Every single one of us has done sinful things, thought, intended, purposed, tried, would have tried if we thought we could have gotten away with it, terrible things, right? That's true of every human. Having been a sinner does not make you deserving of terrible treatment. So, yeah, none of them were perfect and none of us are either. And so just because these women were imperfect, they don't then deserve illegal treatment. They don't deserve to have their death go unreported. They don't deserve to be bullied by their husband and tried to get put into a mental institution when you're just having a natural grievous reaction to his philandering, right? None of us deserve these things, and they didn't either. So the benefit of this book to all of us is that by showing these women as imperfect as they were, we all get to, instead of idolizing them, we get to actually grow in discernment. We get to grow in wisdom. So it's an imperfect book, but worth the hearing. That's my final analysis, is that no, the book is not perfect. It's not authoritative. It's worth the read. It's an interesting, fascinating collection that does help us see more clearly. And I'm grateful for that. Finally, I just want to say to each one of you, thank you so much. Thank you for making it this far, just even on this video, but also thank you for making it this many videos in. I'm so grateful for each one of you that have made this journey with me, that have thought through these things with me. I'm thankful for those of you who have given me negative feedback, any feedback. Many of you have been wonderfully encouraging, but the good, the bad, the corrective input is really helpful. I certainly don't know everything. I am still in many ways a Kennedy novice, and so I have appreciated you guys filling in the gaps, correcting me when I mispronounce something, when I misperceive something. Many times I have thought one thing happened and you guys tell me, no, wait, you need to understand such and such. I find that so helpful. I'm really grateful. And so the comments section, I just want to express again, I think I've said it once, but I feel like I have the very best community. You guys have been amazing. You guys are kind, encouraging, you're corrective when it's necessary, and I appreciate that. But more than anything, you guys are just curious learners, and it makes me so happy because I get to learn right alongside you. So I am so grateful you've been on this journey with me. I hope that you will join me for CHAPPAQUIDDICK, but I just want to mostly thank you for joining me for Ask Not. You guys have a great day. Bye.